This is part 2 of Serial Victims. There also will be a part 3, as there is just so much to tell you about these cases. In part 1, we told you about the murders of 23-year-old Diane McAnally, 26-year-old Karen McGregor, 22-year-old Leona McGovern, and 34-year-old Marjorie Roberts, and the subsequent investigations into their murders. But sadly, as I mentioned in part 1, the killings of Glasgow sex workers in the 90s and early 2000s did not stop there, continuing to fuel fears that there may be a serial killer at work, despite the police continuing to deny this was the case. Jacqueline Gallagher lived with her long-term boyfriend, Gordon Fraser, in a flat in the Foxbar area of Paisley in Renfrewshire, which is a town that borders Glasgow to the east and is located about 15 miles or 24 kilometres west of Glasgow city centre. Jacqueline was very petite, being 5'1" or 1.55 metres in height, and weighing only 7 stone or 44.5 kilograms, and was said to be a lovely, generous and stunning girl who loved music and had dreams of becoming a nurse. Jacqueline had grown up close to her mum Alice, stepdad Robert, and 2 younger siblings, Charlotte and Joe adored their big sister. However, little did her family know that Jacqueline, at the age of 23, had developed a heroin habit and had begun to take to the streets of Glasgow to earn money to feed her and her boyfriend Gordon's drug habit as a sex worker. Hiding the fact she was addicted to heroin and was a sex worker must have taken its toll on Jacqueline, fearing that her family would be disappointed in her and may disown her. And so, despite still being a close family, Jacqueline's visits to her family home began to become less often. And by the 24th of June 1996, Jacqueline and her family had not spoken or seen each other since the previous year, with her stepdad Robert saying in an article in the Herald newspaper on the 26th of June 1996 that, "We did not keep in touch that much, but that was quite normal. We certainly didn't have a row." On the evening of Sunday the 23rd of June 1996, 26-year-old Jacqueline Gallagher left the flat she shared with her boyfriend in Paisley, walked to the nearest bus stop and caught a bus into Glasgow to begin her work for the night, walking the streets of the ever-dangerous Drag. Jacqueline's beaten-up, strangled and half-naked body, wearing only a pink t-shirt and black ankle boots, was found on Monday the 24th of June 1996, about 10 a.m, in bushes near a bus stop at the side of a lay-by off a main road in Bowling in Dumbartonshire, a 23-minute drive northwest of where she had last been seen on Bothwell Street, a street that was part of Glasgow's red light district, in the early hours of Monday morning. However, unlike the previous sex worker murders, where there had been very little or no evidence or lines of inquiry, upon a murder inquiry being launched, detectives investigating Jacqueline's murder, led by Detective Chief Inspector Jeanette Joyce, were afforded a number of lines of inquiry, including one piece of evidence that detectives were sure would lead directly to the murderer. The details of this evidence was not immediately released to the public, but would it indeed lead detectives to Jacqueline's murderer when it was released? Detectives did, however, state almost immediately that Jacqueline's murder was being treated in isolation and was not being linked with the deaths of the 4 other sex workers, despite certain similarities between some of the deaths, with the post-mortem revealing that Jacqueline had been repeatedly attacked with a hammer, suffering 118 injuries, with at least 46 of these being to her head and neck, resulting in a fractured skull, jaw and cheekbones, and her teeth being knocked out. She also had bite marks on her body, ligature marks on her wrists, and had injuries to her hands that suggested she tried to fight her attacker off, before she then was strangled to death, possibly by an S&M studded collar that had been found at the scene. Following an appeal being made for Jacqueline's clients to come forward to be questioned, Detective Chief Inspector Joyce advised that they had received a good response, however went on to say that so far nobody who had had sex with Jacqueline on the night of her murder had come forward, and she again urged them to do so, stressing in an article in the Herald Scotland on the 26th of June 1996 that anyone who did come forward, be it Jacqueline's fellow sex workers or clients, that they would be treated in the strictest confidence. She followed this up by saying that police would be making inquiries into tracing these men, so it might save them a great deal of embarrassment if they come to us. However, while it stated in an article on the 3rd of July, 10 days after Jacqueline's murder, that more than 300 people, which included sex workers who worked alongside Jacqueline and their clients, had been interviewed by police, in an article in the Courier and Advertiser, Detective Chief Inspector Joyce stated that they were still seeking men who had been with Jacqueline on the night of her murder, and that she felt frustrated by the lack of help from the public. Going on to say in an article in the Daily Record that it's because the victim was a sex worker and a drug addict. But are people really saying that she deserved to die? That it's okay for some man to batter her to a pulp and snuff her out? What people have to focus on is that this is a wee girl who died, a real person. This was Alice Wilson's daughter. DCI Joyce vowed to break down the wall of silence she and her officers had thus far experienced. Now, upon CCTV footage being reviewed from Bothwell Street and the area where Jacqueline's body had been found, the police were keen to trace a black BMW car that had been seen twice in Bothwell Street on the morning of Jacqueline's murder, where Jacqueline had been working, and again about 4 a.m. in the same lay-by in Bowling, where Jacqueline's body had been found. Also caught on CCTV was a white van that had been seen parked close to the lay-by, where Jacqueline's body had been found, and so police were appealing for the drivers of both vehicles to come forward. Had the driver of one of these vehicles been Jacqueline's murderer? Jacqueline's stepfather, Robert, also made an appeal for anyone who'd seen Jacqueline in the hours before her murder to come forward, going on to say that the family were in shock, not only about Jacqueline's murder, but also after finding out that she was a sex worker. They had absolutely no idea. Jacqueline's stepdad pleaded for anyone who knew anything to come forward, saying that someone must have seen something. Jacqueline's mum, Alice, gave a brief interview in which she too appealed to anyone with any information to come forward, going on to say, "The man who murdered Jacqueline robbed me of my daughter, and he robbed me of her children, my grandchildren. No matter what she did, my daughter never deserved to die like that, like an animal." She went on to say that while she knew her daughter had a problem, she said that she had not known that her daughter had been a sex worker, and she was worried that this fact would affect people coming forward with information, saying, "They don't see that it's my Wayne who's been killed. They just see the words drug addict and prostitute and switch off." Jacqueline's boyfriend Gordon also spoke out in the Paisley Daily Express on the 4th of July 1996, where he said that he had pleaded with Jacqueline not to go out on the streets the very night she was murdered, but that Jacqueline had refused as she needed the money. And 11 days after Jacqueline's murder, Gordon told the newspaper that, "At times I feel I can't go on." But despite this, he said he was trying to help police with their inquiry. As the investigation into Jacqueline's murder continued and CCTV footage continued to be searched, in an article in the Lennox Herald on the 12th of July 1996, police were again appealing, this time for a man to come forward who had been captured on CCTV footage in the company of Jacqueline on Bothwell Street about 3 a.m. on the morning she was found murdered. This man was described as being in his early 30s, about 6 foot or 1.83 metres tall, of medium build, with light brown hair which was short at the sides and on top, but longer at the back, who had been wearing a light-coloured shirt and jeans. However, the police were far from out of leads, having one final piece of evidence that they now were ready to reveal to the public, having received permission from the Procurator Fiscal to do this. It was revealed that when Jacqueline had been found, she had been wrapped in a distinctive homemade curtain, so distinctive in fact that the police felt sure that someone would recognise it, that someone would know who it belonged to, and that they would soon have the name of Jacqueline's killer. According to an article in the Herald, the curtains were made of a cotton rayon material with a mauve, pink and green swirling leaf pattern. They were 108 by 58 inches or 274 by 147 centimetres. The curtain was lined with white cotton material with blue dots, had a 4-inch or 10 centimetre false hem and hooks in the header tape, and they were homemade using a sewing machine. It was reported in the same newspaper by Detective Chief Inspector Joyce that the material had been imported from Holland in 1994, would have been relatively easy to obtain, and may have been purchased in either a shop or a market, costing about £5 or $6 a metre. Detective Chief Inspector Joyce felt pretty sure that this curtain was one of a pair and had recently been hanging in a window, saying in an article in the Courier and Advertiser that someone must have sold this material, someone has bought this material, someone has converted it into a curtain, someone must know where it has been hung, someone must know where the other half is to make a set. She ended by asking anyone who recognised the description of the curtain to come forward with any information, but the detectives would be contacting material distributors and retailers in their inquiries. While these lines of inquiries were being investigated, despite police and Jacqueline's boyfriend and family making appeals for information and police receiving a good response from the public, with more than 300 people having been interviewed, following CCTV footage being reviewed, it was determined that there was still a number of men that had been in the red light district on the night that Jacqueline had been murdered that were yet to come forward to be questioned. And so, in an article in the Courier and Advertiser on the 13th of August 1996, almost 2 months after Jacqueline's body was found, again police stated that unless these men came forward to be questioned and eliminated from the murder inquiry, they would have no choice but to publish their photographs, and that they had 7 days to come forward or the photographs would be released. Despite this threat, not all of these men came forward. And as the end of September approached, there were still no further developments in tracing Jacqueline's murderer, which had left Jacqueline's family in limbo, as her body had still not been released, and her family were not able to arrange her funeral. On the 23rd of September 1996, exactly 3 months after Jacqueline's body had been found, the stress and grief appeared to have become too much for Jacqueline's boyfriend Gordon, who was 35 years old, as he climbed onto his roof, taking with him several polystyrene boards in protest, and begged for help in catching Jacqueline's killer, begged whoever was shielding her killer to please contact the police, so that he and Jacqueline's family could finally hold a funeral for her. According to the Paisley Daily Express, the polystyrene boards read, "I cannot even say God rest you, baby, as she is lying in limbo. 11 years me and Jackie were together. We had so much to live for. Now only heartache with each day that passes." Gordon was ordered down from the roof after an hour by 2 police officers, and he was not charged for his demonstration. What it did lead to, though, was Detective Chief Inspector Joyce revealing that a dramatic reconstruction of the last hours of Jacqueline's life, from leaving the home she shared with her boyfriend on the night of Sunday the 22nd of June and leading up to her body being found on Monday the 23rd of June about 10 a.m, would be recorded for the BBC programme Crime Watch, and that she hoped this would generate a good response and potentially more leads. The reconstruction appeared on Crime Watch on the 1st of October 1996, and Jacqueline's mum Alice spoke on the programme about the nightmare she was still going through, and Jacqueline's boyfriend Gordon was also heard speaking on the programme. CCTV images of the men who had been seen in the Bothwell area but who had still not come forward were also shown, and detectives made another appeal for information about the black BMW that had been seen twice in the Bothwell Street area and in the lay-by hours before Jacqueline had been found, and the distinctive curtain. DCI Joyce felt confident that the reconstruction being shown on Crime Watch would give the inquiry a much-needed boost, saying, "We have to catch Jacqueline's killer, and soon," before apparently admitting in an article in the Paisley Daily Express that the killer could strike again, despite police officers being adamant that none of the sex worker murders were linked, that the only connection was the victims' lifestyles, and that a serial killer was not walking the streets of Glasgow. Despite DCI Joyce's confidence that the reconstruction of Jacqueline's last hours appearing on Crime Watch would generate further leads, by the 25th of October 1996, the day of Jacqueline's funeral, as finally Jacqueline's family had been allowed to lay her to rest, Jacqueline's murderer still remained at large, and the investigation was beginning to go cold. Jacqueline's funeral in Paisley was attended by about 70 mourners, and led by Reverend Ian Curry. Reverend Curry spoke of the shock, suddenness and brutality of Jacqueline's death, and he asked the mourners to not make any moral judgments about her lifestyle, going on to say, according to an article in the Herald on the 26th of October 1996, that, "In a way, this is a crime which makes victims of us all. It puts those who work beside Jackie in fear. It reminds the rest of us just how uncaring our society can be when it places women in situations where this kind of hideous murder can take place. He went on to describe Jacqueline as being generous, likeable, and much loved by her family and friends, before urging anyone who was withholding information out of a fear or a misplaced sense of loyalty to come forward. After the service, as Jacqueline's coffin was being carried out of the church, Jacqueline's mum Alice and Jacqueline's younger sister and brother, Charlotte and Joe, broke down in tears. And as Jacqueline was finally laid to rest, her boyfriend Gordon broke down at the graveside, falling to his knees and weeping uncontrollably, having to be helped away by Jacqueline's stepdad, who himself was struggling to hold his emotions together. DCI Joyce also attended Jacqueline's funeral and stressed afterwards that Jacqueline being buried did not mean it was the end of the murder inquiry, but she did concede that they would need more help from the public in order to catch the killer who had subjected Jacqueline to indescribable violence. However, on the 24th of June 1997, a year after Jacqueline had been murdered, with leads having led nowhere, Jacqueline's mum Alice and DCI Joyce made another appeal for information, with Alice again pleading with the public not to judge Jacqueline on what she did, saying, "I know what the real Jacqueline was like. I don't care what she did. She was my wee girl." DCI Joyce again reiterated the details about the curtain that Jacqueline had been wrapped in, with both women believing this was a vital piece of evidence and that someone must recognise them, with Alice saying in an article in the Daily Record that "some woman sewed that curtain and knows where it hung before that filth put my wee girl's body in it. That woman has got to come forward. She must." However, that information didn't come. No one came forward to say they recognised the curtain that Jacqueline had been wrapped in. The drivers of the black BMW and white van were not identified. All lines of inquiry had led nowhere, and the murder inquiry went cold. Although that wouldn't remain the case, and in 2001 a man was arrested and charged with her murder. Would Jacqueline finally be going to receive justice? Well, we'll get to that, as long before this man was arrested, sadly another Glasgow sex worker was found murdered. And with this now being the 6th sex worker to be found dead in 6 years, and nobody having been convicted for any of the deaths, the pressure was now really on for the police. Tracy Wilde had a bit of a turbulent upbringing and was brought up by her grandparents, Margaret and Thomas Wilde. Tracy's mum, Faye, had given birth to Tracy when Faye was still only a teenager, and she just didn't feel able to cope with raising Tracy, and so her parents stepped in. Tracy lived with her grandparents in a council flat in Springburn, which is located in the north of Glasgow, about 3 miles or 4.8 kilometres from Glasgow city centre. While Tracy was popular at school, she didn't enjoy it much, and so she left when she was 16 years old. By this time, Tracy had already tried cannabis and speed, but her heroin addiction wouldn't take hold until a few years later. Not long after leaving school, Tracy moved out of her grandparents' home in Springburn and moved into her own flat in the Barmulloch area of Glasgow, about a 5-minute car journey from Springburn. Tracy then met and began dating a man called Scott, and in August 1994, when Tracy would have been 18 years old, she and Scott welcomed their daughter, Megan, who Tracy doted on. Scott and Tracy, however, split up, but Tracy's grandfather and Megan's dad, Scott, visited Tracy and Megan regularly. It's not known how much contact Tracy had with her mum as she grew up, but Faye was in Tracy's life. By the time Scott and Tracy had split up, Tracy was addicted to heroin, and she eventually turned to sex work in order to pay for her habit, telling her neighbours, who Tracy had told she had an addiction to heroin, that she saw sex work as morally better than stealing. On the evening of Sunday the 23rd of November 1997, Tracy, who was 5 foot 2 inches or 1.57 metres in height and of slight build, left her flat in Barmulloch and headed into Glasgow city centre to work the streets to earn money for her drug habit. When Tracy didn't turn up for her heroin support group appointment the next day, one of the workers at the support group attended Tracy's top floor flat about 5:30 p.m. to check she was okay. However, there was no answer. The support worker had noticed that the balcony door into Tracy's flat was ajar, and so they spoke to one of Tracy's neighbours who was able to get into Tracy's flat via the balcony door and let the support worker in. Tracy's body was found in her bedroom, fully clothed but with a dressing gown over her. her cause of death being determined as manual strangulation, likely with her dressing gown cord. A murder inquiry immediately began, which was led by Detective Chief Inspector John Sherry, and the first job of the inquiry was to trace Tracy's movements to see who she had been with the previous evening. Following CCTV footage being reviewed and Tracy's neighbours and other sex workers being interviewed, a picture of Tracy's last hours alive began to emerge, and from this, detectives received a number of lines of inquiry. Tracy had left her flat in Barmulloch late on Sunday the 23rd of November and was next seen on Monday the 24th of November at 1:45 a.m. on Bothwell Street, the same street which was part of the red light district that Jacqueline Gallagher had last been seen alive on. 15 minutes later, at 2 a.m, Tracy was seen getting out of a navy blue Ford Escort or Peugeot car and walking towards her flat by one of her neighbours. The man she was with was described as being, according to an article in the Scotsman on the 27th of November 1997, aged between 20 to 30 years old, 5 foot 9 inches to 5 foot 10 inches, or 1.75 to 1.77 metres in height, of medium build, with short light brown hair, being clean shaven and wearing dark clothes. Tracy was next seen at 3:05 a.m. at a drugs crisis centre in Glasgow, this time alone. However, a navy blue Ford Escort or Peugeot car was also spotted outside the same drugs crisis centre in Glasgow at the same time that Tracy was inside. The last sighting of Tracy was at about 3:20 a.m, where she was walking with another man said to be, according to an article in the Scotsman on the 23rd of January 1998, about 30 years old, 5 foot 9 inches or 1.75 metres, with dark hair and wearing a cream-coloured jacket and jeans. It is believed that Tracy and this mystery man made their way to Tracy's flat, and that this man was Tracy's last client and likely her murderer. Tracy wasn't seen alive again, but about 4:40 a.m, Tracy's neighbour heard an argument break out in Tracy's flat, going on to say that she could only hear mumbling voices before hearing Tracy yell, and then there was quiet. The neighbour said she went to investigate, but everything was quiet and she couldn't see into Tracy's flat, presumably via the balcony window. Shortly afterwards, though, she heard Tracy's front door bang shut and keys being rattled, followed again by silence. While this was all useful information in the murder inquiry, the police wanted more, needed more, and so they made an appeal asking for anyone to come forward if they had any information on the driver of the navy blue car or recognised the description of the man seen with Tracy, as well as asking anyone who had seen Tracy in the early hours of Monday morning to come forward, describing Tracy as being 5 foot 2 inches or 1.57 metres tall, with a slim build and shoulder-length black hair, and that she'd been wearing a short red or pink jacket, white top and black trousers. They also appealed to Tracy's regular clients to come forward to be eliminated from the inquiry, going on to say that Tracy's diary had been found by her bedside and that it listed dozens of her clients' telephone numbers, and police urged these men to come forward as they would be contacting everyone on the list, so the sooner they came forward the better, if they didn't want police turning up at their work or home. Tracy's mum, Faye, also made an emotional appeal 2 days after her daughter had been found, saying that while she hadn't known her daughter had been addicted to drugs or was a sex worker, Tracy was still her daughter, and if anyone had any information regarding her daughter's murder, to please come forward. In this same appeal, Detective Chief Inspector John Sherry tried to shut down the ever-present murmurings that a serial killer was targeting sex workers by saying, according to an article in the Scotsman on the 27th of November 1997, that as yet there was no evidence that linked Tracy's murder with the killings of Diane, Karen, Leona, Marjorie or Jackie. However, this didn't stop newspapers and the public continuing to speculate if there was a serial killer targeting Glasgow sex workers. Perhaps it would have been easier for people to accept that there was one man killing all these women, instead of having to acknowledge that men who frequented sex workers could have been capable of murder, and that they were walking the streets of Glasgow freely and targeting the vulnerable sex workers. While there wasn't yet any evidence that linked Tracy's murder to the other sex worker murders, there however was evidence left at Tracy's murder scene, being that of DNA found on her body and fingerprints. So now all the police had to do was wait for that vital piece of information to come in that would lead them directly to Tracy's killer, which the DNA found at the scene would confirm. But sadly, it wasn't going to be that easy. Police officers in the meantime also continued to try and question other sex workers who frequented the red light district in Glasgow to try and glean any information about who may have been with Tracy on the evening she died. And while they said they had a good response, there were still some sex workers who refused to speak to the police. The reason for this was laid out in an article in The Guardian in April 2019, which said that back in the 90s, Glasgow Council and the police operated a zero-tolerance approach to sex workers, whereas in Edinburgh the council and police were more lenient and licences to massage parlours and saunas were issued. Retired DCI Nanette Pollock, who had led on policing the sex industry in Glasgow throughout the 90s, said in the same article that the police force back then was a man's world, and many officers took the attitude that if you tackled prostitution, what will men do? And so because of this view by police officers, many sex workers actively did not want to engage with them, knowing how they were thought of. Now, despite detectives appearing to have a lot of valuable information, including CCTV footage of Tracy with the man who likely had killed her, DNA and fingerprints, by the 14th of January 1998, almost 2 months after Tracy had been found murdered, the police were no closer to finding Tracy's killer, and public interest was waning, with one newspaper headline reading, "Call Girl's killing sparks horror, but little public pity." And so the lead detective, DCI Sherry, knew he had to renew public interest quickly or risk the case going cold. By this time, detectives had tracked down many of Tracy's clients and clients of other sex workers and had obtained DNA samples from them, as well as having taken DNA samples from Tracy's family and friends, adding up to DNA samples having been taken from 200 people. But sadly, no match had been found with the DNA on Tracy. The lead detective knew that they needed to trace the man Tracy had been seen walking along the street with at 3:20 a.m, likely the last person to have seen her alive and likely her killer. They needed to release the footage they had of this man, and so he sought permission from the Procurator Fiscal, which was granted, and 4 stills which showed the man with Tracy was released, along with an appeal for anyone who recognised this man to please come forward. Along with this appeal, Detective Chief Inspector Sherry also stated that as there was no matches from the DNA samples to the DNA found at the murder scene, and not everyone who had frequented sex workers in Glasgow had as yet come forward, they may have to spread out DNA testing wider to include these men, which could include a further 1,000 men being tracked down and asked to provide a DNA sample. With DCI John Sherry saying in an article in The Scotsman on the 14th of January 1998 that, "We've given people the opportunity to come to us first. We've got to the stage now where we are prepared to track them down at their homes or places of work." However, this plan didn't go down well with civil rights groups or the Glasgow Bar Association, who felt that this line of inquiry could cause embarrassment and potentially result in marriages falling apart, that it was essentially blackmail and that a phone call at first should suffice. A number of Scotland's members of Parliament waded into the argument, giving their opinions on the matter, with one MP saying, according to an article in The Scotsman, that the civil liberties of these young women are more important than the civil liberties of their customers. Following the 4 stills of the likely last man to have seen Tracy alive being released, a further 10 detectives joined the murder investigation, bringing the officers involved in hunting Tracy's killer up to 50, as they anticipated a large response to the photos being released, and they wouldn't be disappointed. Overall, thousands of people had been interviewed, including names put forward by Tracy's fellow sex workers, names for who the driver of the navy blue car that had been seen in Glasgow city centre and outside Tracy's flat, and names put forward of who the man last seen walking along the street with Tracy may be, and up to 2,500 DNA samples had been collected. However, despite all of this, despite DCI Sherry saying on the 23rd of January 1998 that, "I am very confident, as I was in the first week of this inquiry, that we will solve this murder," Despite the investigation featuring on the BBC programme Crime Watch, and despite the murder inquiry running for 2.5 years, the investigation stalled and went cold. Tracy's killer remained unknown. Although this wouldn't always remain the case, when in 2013 a cold case review shot Tracy's murder back into the spotlight. However, while Tracy's murder investigation was ongoing, and less than 3 months after Tracy had been found murdered, a 7th sex worker was found dead in February 1998. But unlike the other sex workers' murders, the reporting was slightly different this time in a number of ways. However, this murder did lead to changes being made and important relationships being built. Margaret or Margot Lafferty may have been only 5 foot or 1.52 metres tall and weigh only 7 stone or 44.4 kilograms, but she could handle herself. She was streetwise and had been working as a sex worker on the main streets of Glasgow for over 9 years in order to pay for her drug habit that had got out of control. Margot was one of 7 children, having 6 brothers, who were all brought up in the tough Barlanic area of Glasgow, and it was reported in an article in the Glasgow Times that if anybody tried anything with Margot, they were likely to come off second best. So it was safe to say that Margot had a reputation: tough, heroin addict, sex worker. But that wasn't Margot's whole story. She had another side to her too. Margot's struggle with drugs had begun when she was 18 years old, when she had started taking heroin and temazepam. For a time, Margot managed her heroin and temazepam use and was able to hold down a full-time job working in a hotel. However, as the months passed and her habit began to take control, her wage at the hotel was no longer enough for her, and so she took to the drag, where so many other women who had lost their fight with drugs had ended up before her. Over the years working on the streets of Glasgow, despite Margot's feisty attitude, she quickly made some good friends, and they would frequently see the woman Margot could have been, the warm, caring Margot, who was desperately loyal. However, if you happened to cross Margot, such as not paying her for the drugs she supplied, it wasn't her caring and warm side you would see. Due to the fact that Margot had been a sex worker for so long, could look after herself and was streetwise, when 27-year-old Margot's brutally beaten, naked and strangled body was found on Saturday the 28th of February 1998, 3 months after Tracy Wilde's body had been found, a sense of terror rippled through the sex worker community. While many had been fearful for their safety since the killings of sex workers began in 1991, they always thought that it wouldn't happen to them. But once tough, streetwise Margot's body was found and she too had been murdered, that's when the terror, the fear, really kicked in. If someone like Margot could be murdered, then it could definitely happen to anyone. It appeared that this feeling wasn't just felt by sex workers. Finally, others were taking notice too. Finally, it looked like help and support was being made available to the very vulnerable sex workers of Glasgow. Margot's body had been found at 6 p.m. on Saturday the 28th of February in a doorway off West Regent Lane, a 5-minute walk away from where she had last been seen on Bothwell Street. Margot's injuries had been so severe that following a post-mortem, it was stated that she had suffered a sustained attack, although it was not revealed exactly what her injuries were, only that they were so severe that the possibility she may have been attacked by more than one person was not being ruled out. Margot had been stripped of her clothes, although they didn't appear to have been ripped off her as they were not damaged. Her clothes were scattered on the ground around her, but that wasn't all that was found on the ground around Margot's body. Following officers and forensic teams carrying out a fingertip search of the lane where Margot's body had been found, 5 used condoms were found. However, the lane where Margot's body was found was reportedly a regular place where sex workers took their clients. So, would any DNA found in the used condoms lead to Margot's killer? Margot's clothing was also collected to be forensically examined, an examination which turned up a minute spot of blood thought by detectives to have belonged to Margot's killer. While it was great that there were at least 2 promising leads for detectives to investigate, as before, detectives needed to view CCTV footage in order to try and trace Margot's last movements, and more importantly, to see if it showed who she had last been with, as well as try and speak to other sex workers and clients. And so an appeal was made for anyone who had seen, spoken to, or been with Margot, or if they were aware of anyone who had returned home in the early hours of Saturday, dirty, blood-stained, or with injuries of any kind, to please come forward. While a precise time of death could not be established due to Margot's body having been exposed to some of the worst weather Glasgow had seen that winter, following witnesses being questioned and CCTV being reviewed, and Margot not having been seen again after being spotted on Bothwell Street in the early hours of Saturday morning, it was believed she was likely murdered not long after this sighting. However, as well as this, police also had to try and dampen the ever-present murmurings about there possibly being a serial killer walking the streets of Glasgow, with one article in the Scotsman days after Margot's murder posing the question to its readers, which is worse, one killer on the loose, or perhaps as many as 7 who thus far have gotten away with murder. And in another article in the Scotsman, top criminal psychologist Professor Michael Levy said that the 7 murders could be linked to a serial killer who had a highly religious background and had a bad experience with a prostitute. In the same article, the Yorkshire Ripper called Peter Sutcliffe, who was a serial killer, was also brought up, who back in the 70s began his murder spree by killing sex workers before beginning to murder other women, with the question being posed that were the police not investigating the murders thoroughly because the victims were sex workers? Would their attitude change if it were respectable married women who were being murdered? Going on to say that regardless of whether there was one killer or multiple ones, the police must arrest the person responsible as soon as possible. And so, in an article in the Scotsman on the 3rd of March 1998, 3 days after Margot's body had been found, detectives were insisting that no evidence had so far been uncovered to link the violent deaths of any of the sex workers, going on to state that named suspects had been reported to the Procurator Fiscal for the murders of Diane, Karen, Leona and Marjorie, despite none of the men having been subsequently convicted. Assistant Chief Constable Orr went on to state that the murders of Diane, Karen, Leona and Marjorie were therefore no longer being actively pursued. He did emphasise, though, that the murders of Jacqueline, Tracy and Margot were very much still under investigation, and that while they were keeping an open mind and couldn't categorically rule out a connection between 2 or more of the murders, there was nothing so far that suggested a link between the previous murders and Margot's murder. Something else that was different between Margot's murder and the previous sex worker victims was what appeared in the newspapers. While there had been a notable lack of public interest in the previous murders due to the victims being sex workers, which had frustrated detectives and annoyed the victims' family members, in Margot's case, while there was much more of a public interest, sadly it wasn't the kind of attention that detectives or Margot's friends and family sought. In an article in the Scotsman on the 3rd of March, 3 days after Margot's body had been found, one of Margot's sex worker friends told of how Margot had brought danger into her life on a number of occasions. She told of how Margot, on one occasion, had gone back to a client's home, and whilst there she had stolen some of his mother's jewellery. When she was caught, the man had gone and got his friend, and the 2 men had badly beaten Margot, giving her a black eye and causing her to walk with a limp. However, this didn't stop Margot, and she continued to regularly steal from her clients, despite the risks of being beaten up, or worse. It was also reported in the same article by another of Margot's sex worker friends that Margot had done a lot of street sex, frequently taking men who approached her on the street up dark alleys, with her friends saying that this was something a lot of sex workers will not do due to the added risk, where Margot would go on to mug the men, believing that it was very unlikely they would report this to the police. The friend went on to say that getting into a stranger's car sounds dangerous, but the other girls make a show of taking down the car registration. That makes blokes think twice about doing you in. Following this article being published, Margot's murder became the secondary story, as reporters had jumped on this new angle, with a headline in the Scotsman the very next day reading, "Dead prostitute, a serial mugger," with the article going on to state that Margot had even resorted to mugging other younger sex workers to help fund her £100 or $127 a day heroin habit, and that one sex worker believed that Margot must have taken that bloke up West Regent Lane and then tried to mug him, and he turned violent on her. A couple of days later, another angle had been found when an article in the Daily Record read, "Murdered Vice Girl Margot was drug queen of the drag." In this article, it speculated that Margot may have been murdered over unpaid drug debts, going on to say that Margot was the most feared pusher in Glasgow's red light district. It was claimed that Margot used a lesbian lover to help beat up girls who didn't pay for their supplies, but that Margot may have actually owed a significant amount of money to a ruthless drugs kingpin. Another theory in the article of why Margot had perhaps been murdered was due to a turf war she had had with sex workers in Edinburgh, when Margot had apparently tried to muscle in on their patch. Sadly, articles like this continued until the 20th of March 1998, when a sex worker friend of Margot said in an article that the girls believe they are viewed as scum. You only have to look at the tabloid press after Margot's death. She was painted as a vicious thug. She was an ordinary girl trying to come off drugs, and no demon. We are not less than human. We are forced to sell sex for a good reason. In my case, it was to feed a drug habit, which I've overcome, and now I work to pay fines. We are hassled and hounded and forced into danger to avoid arrest. A social worker backed up these claims by saying that the biggest pimp in Glasgow is the courts. The girls are working to pay their fines to them, with another sex worker stating in an article in The Scotsman that the police are forever lifting us and fining us £200 a time for soliciting. The only way to pay that kind of cash is to go back on the streets, so they lift us again, and it just goes on, and they claim they want us off the streets. It was reported that at the time of Margot's murder, she owed £1,000 or $1,270 in court fines, following a Strathclyde Police Spotlight initiative with CCTV showing officers where sex workers were operating, although a spokesperson for Strathclyde Police said that CCTV cameras were not used to identify where sex workers were working, and that identifying sex workers was the job of officers on the ground. Either way, it appeared the only option for sex workers was to stay on the relatively safer streets where the CCTV cameras were and likely be fined, or take a huge risk at a time when sex workers were being murdered and venture away from the cameras, with Margot having opted for the latter. Now, with Margot's murder having seemed finally to have got people to realise the danger facing the sex workers of Glasgow, it was reported on the 6th of March that police would be handing out personal alarms to sex workers, as well as offering self-defence classes. However, some sex workers had their own deterrents in place, with one reporting they carried hairspray in their handbags, while another reported she carried a syringe that was filled with HIV-positive blood and that she would stab anyone who tried to attack her. While sex workers and community workers welcomed the help offered by police, it was reported that the initiative was confusing, as sex workers were being given personal alarms at one end of the street, while at the other they were being arrested for soliciting, which is why a sex tolerance zone in the city was still being called for, which would enable sex workers to safely carry out their work in full view of cameras, reducing the dangers facing sex workers, and of them being fined for soliciting. It was reported that Glasgow City Council licensing officials were examining the possibility of a sauna system working in Glasgow as it was in Edinburgh. Andrea Denovan, who worked at Bay 75, which had been set up to help sex workers, said that a large proportion of the between 500 and 800 sex workers in Glasgow had drug problems, and therefore such establishments as saunas would not employ them, deeming sex tolerance zones to appear to be the only way forward. Now, while this debate was raging in the community and in the newspapers, the fact that Margot Lafferty had recently been murdered appeared to have been forgotten by many, but not by all. Police officers were working hard behind the scenes, desperately trying to catch Margot's killer. And while it had taken more than 60 detectives, hundreds of men being interviewed and almost all of the sex workers who worked on the drag, and hundreds of DNA samples being taken, on Saturday the 9th of May 1998, just over 2 months since Margot's body had been found, it appeared there had been a breakthrough, when it was reported in the Aberdeen Press and Journal that a man was being held in connection with Margot's death. This was 19-year-old Brian Donnelly, whose name had been given to the police following an appeal which asked for the names of men who'd been seen with recent facial injuries, after finding out that Margot could look after herself and so had likely fought hard for her life. A work colleague of Brian's came forward to say that they had all gone for a night out in Glasgow city centre on the night Margot had been murdered to celebrate Brian turning 19. The colleague went on to report that upon Brian turning up for work on Monday, he was noted to have scratches and bruising to his face. When he was asked how this had happened, Brian had given 4 separate reasons, one being that it had been caused by a girl he had confronted when she tried to jump the taxi queue, and another being he had been scratched by a cat. Thinking this was strange, and after hearing the appeal, Brian's work colleague decided to give Brian's name to the police. Upon Brian being brought in for questioning and being asked to provide a DNA sample, when compared to the condoms found at the scene, 2 condoms were found to match, as well as with the minute spot of blood that had been found on Margot's clothing. Brian Donnelly was subsequently charged with Margot's murder, and his trial date was set for October at the High Court in Glasgow. Police felt extremely confident that they had found Margot's killer, and that this finally would prove that there wasn't a serial killer walking the streets of Glasgow. However, there was a problem. Following reviewing CCTV footage earlier in the investigation, police had discovered that a man called David Payne had been picking up sex workers in Glasgow's red light district the very night Margot had been murdered, and so he had been brought in for questioning. Initially, police had felt strongly that this could be Margot's killer, after finding out that he had been in prison previously and on numerous occasions for sexually assaulting women at knife point, only having been released 2 years prior. Detectives were able to rule out David Payne as being Margot's killer. However, they were obliged to disclose this information to Brian's defence team, who jumped on this and lodged a special defence of incrimination, naming David Payne as Margot's murderer. Would Margot receive justice, or would her case end up like the 6 sex workers who had been murdered before her, unresolved? The trial began in October 1998 and lasted 9 days. In that time, the defence tried to convince the jury that David Payne had been the actual murderer of Margot, stating that one of the condoms found at the scene had contained his DNA. However, the fact that 2 condoms contained Brian's DNA, that his blood had been found on Margot's clothing, the fact his face had been covered in scratches and bruises, and the fact he had been caught on security camera walking away with Margot on Bothwell Street shortly before 2 a.m. on the day she was found dead, wasn't warming the jury to the suggestion that David Payne was in fact Margot's murderer. Apparently, Brian also admitted in court, after denying profusely that he had been the man seen with Margot at 2 a.m, said that yes, he had been the man with her, and he had paid her £40 for 2 sex sessions, but that they had parted amicably afterwards. His counsel also stated that if he had killed Margot, why would he then go to work the following week with scratches on his face, with his defence saying that this was just a badge of guilt. The defence also pointed out that as Margot had been found naked, but none of her clothes were damaged, this suggested that she was made to strip, possibly at knife point, again pointing to David Payne's known offences of assaulting women at knife point. However, on the 6th of November 1998, the jury had made its mind up, and it was that Brian Connolly was guilty of Margot's murder, and he was given a life sentence. A sense of relief was felt from Margot's family and friends, with her mother Marjorie saying afterwards that Margot might have been a prostitute, but she was still a lovely lassie with a heart of gold. She didn't deserve to die the way she did. Nobody does. She went on to say that Brian Donnelly was just pure evil. It was never determined exactly why Brian Donnelly had murdered Margot, brutally beating and strangling her. But it was suggested that maybe she had tried to rob him and he had killed her out of anger, before then stealing all of her money and her black leather jacket. Regardless of why Margot had been murdered, a spokesperson for Strathclyde Police said that this verdict should send out 2 messages, one being that there was not a serial killer targeting Glasgow sex workers, and 2, that it demonstrated that Glasgow sex workers will not be seen as fair game for anyone who wishes to abuse them. They went on to say that Brian Connolly was not involved in the murders of Jacqueline Gallagher or Tracy Wilde, and that the investigations into their murders would continue. However, perhaps the police shouldn't have felt quite so confident, as it wouldn't be the last time that Brian Connolly would be in court in connection with Margot Lafferty's murder. There is still so much to tell you. Why was Brian back in court in connection with Margot's murder? Would Jacqueline Gallagher and Tracy Wilde ever receive justice? And then there's the final sex worker murder to tell you about. And despite the measures that had been put in place for the vulnerable sex workers of Glasgow, we'll hear how the fear continued. Thank you again to Megan Grant for suggesting I cover these cases. Join me for part 3, where you'll hear all that and much more. But before I go, I just wanted to give a wee shout out. I recently went to Glasgow to take part in something quite exciting that I'll tell you about as soon as I can. But while I was there, I desperately needed my makeup touched up so I could look my best, or as best as I can look. So I want to say a huge thank you to Kirsty in the Buchanan Galleries, who is also a fan of true crime podcasts. It was lovely to meet you, and I really appreciated your makeup skills that day for sure. Thank you.
Scottish Murders is a production of Clurin Ton.